What in God's name do you think you're doing? The voice was like gravel grinding against steel, a sound so rich with fury and authority, it seemed to suck the very air from the room. Clara Hayes froze, her fingers hovering a millimeter above the laptop's keyboard. The screen's cold blue light illuminated the stark terror blooming on her face, turning her simple black waitress uniform into the garb of a common criminal caught in the act. She swiveled on the plush leather chair, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, as the man emerged from the shadows of the restaurant's most exclusive private dining room. It was him, Julian Croft, the titan of Wall Street, the phantom of the financial world, a man whose net worth was discussed in the same hushed tones as the national debt. He was older than his photos suggested, his silver hair impeccably styled, but his eyes, a piercing, glacial blue, were exactly as described. They didn't just look at you, they audited you. His gaze flickered from her face to the screen of his ultra-thin laptop, and his features hardened into a mask of pure contempt. This is a private terminal, running a proprietary system. Who the hell gave you permission to touch it? Clara's mouth opened, but only a dry rasp escaped. Mr. Croft, sir, I was just clearing the table. The screensaver, it glitched, and I saw. She never finished. In two long strides, he was upon her, his hand clamping around her upper arm like a vice. The strength in his grip was astonishing, a brutal reminder of the power he wielded in every aspect of his life. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice dropped to a low, menacing snarl that was far more terrifying. You saw nothing. You are a waitress, you bring water, and you take away empty plates. You do not touch things that are not yours. Get out. He punctuated the command with a sharp, dismissive shove. Clara stumbled back, catching her balance on the edge of the heavy mahogany table. Tears of humiliation and fear stung her eyes. Please, you don't understand, she pleaded, her voice trembling. Your algorithm. There's a recursive loop in the arbitrage protocol. It's creating a ghost sequence. Someone is siphoning. Out, he thundered, his face a thundercloud of rage. He wasn't listening. He saw a nosy 22-year-old girl in a cheap uniform babbling nonsense about his life's work, his fortress of code. The insult was profound. He saw intrusion, and his every instinct screamed to neutralize the threat. Clara clutched her stained apron, her knuckles white. The hours she'd spent in this room, refilling his water, clearing his plates, all while catching glimpses of the mesmerizing, beautiful streams of data on his screen, had led to this. A discovery that could save him, and a dismissal that could break her. I wasn't trying to spy, she whispered, her words nearly lost in the opulent silence of the room. I was trying to help. There's a flaw, a tiny one, but it's compounding. I saw the pattern. He had already turned his back, his attention fixed on the laptop as if to cleanse it of her touch. He reached for the secure phone on the table, his thumb hovering over the speed dial for his head of security. As she backed toward the door, defeated, her spirit crushed not by his anger, but by his complete and utter refusal to see her as anything more than a piece of the furniture, she heard it, a sharp intake of breath. He had glanced at the screen, not at the main display, but at the small diagnostic window she had opened. It was filled with lines of annotation, terse and elegant, written in a shorthand that was both foreign and yet deeply, disturbingly familiar. His eyes narrowed. He leaned closer, his fury momentarily forgotten, replaced by a cold, prickling sense of disbelief. The analysis was flawless. It identified the exact point of divergence in the code, a place where a sub-millisecond delay was being exploited to skim 0.001 cents from every single transaction. It wasn't a hack from the outside. It was a parasite woven into the very DNA of his system. But it was the style, the intellectual fingerprint of the analysis that made his blood run cold. It was the same lean, predictive logic, the same uncanny foresight he had seen once before. 6 months ago in an anonymous white paper posted on a niche financial theory forum, a paper that had predicted the collapse of a rival firm's currency exchange platform, signed only with the pseudonym Cassandra. He had spent a fortune trying to find Cassandra. He'd offered 7-figure consulting fees, dispatched headhunters to every corner of the globe. The author had remained a ghost, And now that ghost handwriting was on his screen, typed by the trembling fingers of a waitress. Julian Croft turned slowly, the phone forgotten in his hand. His eyes were different now. The rage was gone, replaced by an intense, unnerving focus. He looked at Clara not as an intruder, but as an impossible paradox. "You," he said, the word hanging in the air like a verdict. "You wrote this analysis?" Clara stood by the door, one hand on the brass handle, poised for flight. She was terrified he might lunge at her again, but she met his gaze. The fear was still there, but beneath it, a tiny ember of defiance flickered. "I saw the pattern on a napkin first," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I used to watch my grandfather do the same thing. Look for the rhythms the machines miss." His eyes locked on hers. "Cassandra," he stated, not as a question, but as an accusation. She gave the faintest, almost imperceptible nod. "Clara Ann Hayes," she corrected softly. "But yes, sometimes I'm Cassandra." The silence that followed was dense and absolute. The city hummed 20 stories below, but in that room time had stopped. "You're a waitress," he said again, the words stripped of their earlier venom, now just a statement of profound confusion. "I wasn't always," she whispered, the familiar ache of her past rising in her throat. "Before this, before my family lost everything, I was supposed to be a mathematician." Julian stood motionless, the moment stretching between them, thick with the weight of shattered assumptions. He looked from the brilliant analysis on the screen to the young woman in the worn-out shoes, her face pale but her eyes holding a depth he hadn't noticed before. The imprint of his fingers was likely already forming a bruise on her arm. "My office, tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp," he said, his voice clipped, betraying none of the turmoil raging within him. "Don't be late." He didn't apologize. He didn't offer her job back. But as he turned back to the screen, his expression was that of a man who had just stumbled upon a key to a lock he never knew existed. And for the first time in years, Clara felt a terrifying sliver of hope that someone finally might be willing to see the mind behind the apron. The lobby of Croft Capital felt like the inside of a glacier, vast, silent, and intimidatingly cold. Polished marble floors reflected the severe lines of the architecture, and the only sound was the hushed whisper of the ventilation system. Clara sat on the edge of a severe leather sofa, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. She'd spent her last $40 on a simple, professional-looking navy blue dress from a second-hand store. It was clean and pressed, but she felt as out of place as a sparrow in an eagle's nest. A faint, purplish bruise was beginning to bloom on her arm where he had grabbed her, a stark reminder of how this improbable meeting had begun. She had spent a sleepless night replaying the confrontation, the mix of terror and exhilaration leaving her exhausted. She'd checked on her grandfather, asleep in his small room, the faint scent of antiseptic and old books clinging to the air. He was the reason for all of this. His brilliant career as a financial analyst had been shattered by the 2008 crash, his reputation ruined, his health failing soon after. He had taught her to see the stories in the numbers, the poetry in the patterns, the human greed hidden in the cold logic of algorithms. She was his legacy, and she had failed him by serving coffee to the very men who had built the new world on the ruins of his own. At precisely 9:02 a.m., a door hissed open. Julian Croft stood there, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her grandfather's medical bills for the year. His face was a stone mask, his eyes giving nothing away. "In here." His office was less a room and more a kingdom. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window, offering a godlike view of Central Park. The other walls were lined with books, not decorative, leather-bound sets, but worn, well-read volumes on mathematics, economic theory, and history. A massive desk, clear of everything but 2 monitors and a single elegant fountain pen, sat in the center. He didn't offer her a seat. He remained standing, circling behind the desk to face the window, his back to her. "Cassandra," he began, his voice calm, measured, "the white paper you published on the Klein Hedge Currency Fund. You predicted its collapse to the day, 3 months in advance." "How?" Clara took a steadying breath. This was her language. This she knew. Their algorithm was too perfect, she said, her voice clearer now. It was designed to hedge against volatility, but it didn't account for human panic. It saw predictable patterns, but people aren't predictable. When the first rumor of instability hit, the algorithm kept buying, assuming a market correction. A human would have known it was a run. I didn't analyze their code. I analyzed their hubris. He turned slowly, one eyebrow slightly raised. You make it sound like philosophy. It is, she replied. Every market is a story of fear and greed. The code is just the grammar. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze so intense she felt like a specimen under a microscope. You said your family lost everything. When? 2008. My father had his pension in mortgage-backed securities. My grandfather, he was one of the few who warned against them. He was called a dinosaur, an old man who didn't understand the new models. When the market collapsed, he wasn't vindicated. He was just broken. The admission hung in the air. Julian's expression flickered with something unreadable. He had been one of the architects of those new models, a pioneer of the quantitative analysis that had reshaped the world. And that's why you're a waitress? Penance? The question was laced with a cynical edge. No, survival, she said, a flash of anger cutting through her fear. When you're blacklisted, you take what you can get. After my grandfather's second stroke, his medical debt, it doesn't care if you have a degree in theoretical mathematics. Blacklisted? By whom? I tried to report a flaw in a university endowment fund's trading software during my senior year. It was skimming funds meant for scholarships. They told me I was mistaken. A week later, my scholarship was revoked for academic misconduct. My professor, the one who designed the fund, made sure my name was poison at every firm I applied to. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He walked over to his desk and tapped a few keys on his keyboard. A complex chart filled one of the monitors. It was his system's real-time performance data. The ghost sequence you identified last night, he said, his tone all business now. My team has been chasing it for months. They thought it was a server lag, a rounding error. They never considered it was intentional. How long did it take you to find it? About 10 minutes to see the pattern, Claire admitted. Another 20 to isolate the code. I recognize the structure. It's a variant of a parasitic algorithm. It hides in plain sight by mimicking the host's primary function. He stared at the screen, then back at her. The silence stretched. I have a team of 50 analysts, all with PhDs from MIT and Caltech, he said softly, almost to himself. And none of them saw it. He finally looked directly at her, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his armor of cynicism. They see the grammar. You see the story. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Sit down. Clara sat, her legs feeling weak. I'm not going to offer you a job, he said bluntly, and her heart sank. Jobs are for people who fit into a corporate structure. You don't. I'm offering you a problem. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. Someone inside my company planted that code. Someone with C-suite level access. They are stealing from me, pennies at a time, but it amounts to millions per quarter. They are smart, they are careful, and they are invisible. I want you to find them. Clara blinked. You want me to hunt them? I want you to be Cassandra, he said, his voice dropping. You will have a provisional contract, a consultant title. You'll answer only to me. No one will know your real purpose. To everyone else, you'll be a junior data analyst, a nobody, but you will have access to everything, the entire system, every line of code, every transaction log. He paused, his gaze hardening. But if you are wrong, if you fail, or if you are discovered, I will deny I ever knew you. You will be a waitress who got lucky for a week. Do you understand? This was not a rescue. This was a trial by fire, a chance to use the skills that had cost her everything, but with stakes higher than she could possibly imagine. It was a terrifying, reckless, impossible offer. I have one condition, Clara said, her voice shaking but firm. Julian Croft did not look like a man who accepted conditions. And what is that? My grandfather's medical care, the best, all of it covered, and a signing bonus sufficient to clear his existing debt. He stared at her, a long, unblinking assessment. He was testing her motivation. Was it greed, revenge, ambition? He saw none of that. He saw the fierce, desperate loyalty of a granddaughter who would walk through fire for her family. It was a currency he understood better than money. A slow, thin smile touched his lips for the first time. It did not reach his eyes. "Done," he said. He picked up the fountain pen, pulled a single sheet of paper from a drawer, and began to write. "Your new life starts now, Miss Hayes. Try not to get yourself erased." Clara's office was a repurposed storage closet on the 34th floor, nestled between the humming server racks and a forgotten collection of obsolete hardware. It had no window, a single flickering fluorescent light, and the constant low thrum of the building's electronic heartbeat. For Clara, it was a palace. On a simple metal desk sat a state-of-the-art terminal, its screen glowing with the promise of unlimited access. Julian had been true to his word. Her login credentials opened doors that even senior partners couldn't walk through. For the first 2 days, she did nothing but immerse herself, reading the code like a vast, sprawling novel. She traced the flow of capital, the logic of the trades, the digital ghosts of decisions made in microseconds. It was the most beautiful and dangerous thing she had ever seen. Her presence did not go unnoticed. She was a ghost in the machine, a name on an access log with no history. The other analysts, sharp-suited men and women who moved with the predatory grace of sharks, eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. They saw her second-hand dress, her quiet demeanor, and the way she ate her packed lunch alone in her closet office, and they dismissed her. She was a diversity hire, a clerical error, a temporary fixture soon to be gone. This anonymity was her shield. While they saw a nobody, she saw everything. She watched their keystrokes, their login times, the quiet queries they ran when they thought no one was looking. She was hunting for a shadow, and shadows are only visible at the edges of the light. The primary suspect, according to Julian's own private notes, was Alistair Finch, the chief operating officer. Finch was everything Julian was not: young, slick, and a master of corporate politics. He spoke in buzzwords and managed by spreadsheet, his ambition a palpable force field. He treated Julian with a public deference that bordered on worship. But Clara, watching his digital footprint, saw something else. Finch ran simulations constantly, testing the system's boundaries, pushing the limits of the trading algorithm in ways that seemed less about optimization and more about identifying weaknesses. He was probing the fortress for cracks. Clara started her own quiet probe. She couldn't look directly at Finch's files without triggering alarms. Instead, she looked around them. She analyzed the access logs for the specific block of code where the parasitic algorithm resided. The original code had been written by Julian himself a decade ago. It had been updated 3 times. The last update, 18 months prior, was logged under the credentials of the former chief technology officer, a man who had retired abruptly 6 months later, citing health reasons. Clara dug deeper. She pulled the retired CTO's personnel file. On the surface, it was perfect, but buried in the financials was a single, massive wire transfer to an offshore account, dated 1 week after his retirement. The amount was precisely what the ghost sequence would have skimmed over the course of a year. It was a payoff, a golden parachute for his silence. But who had paid him? Finch had been the one to approve the CTO's final bonus package. It was a connection, but it was circumstantial. She needed proof. Her chance came during a routine system diagnostic. A mandatory building-wide maintenance check was scheduled for a Saturday. Most of the staff would be gone. Finch, however, was a notorious workaholic. Clara wagered he would be there. She spent Friday night setting her trap. She created a honeypot, a decoy file disguised as a system vulnerability report. She named it Project Cassandra, a piece of bait she knew Finch, who had been part of the fruitless search for the anonymous analyst, wouldn't be able to resist. She embedded a tracker in the file, a tiny piece of code that would ping her with the user's exact location and activity the moment it was opened. On Saturday morning, Claire arrived at the deserted office building, dressed in her old Waitress uniform. To the skeleton security crew, she was just a weekend temp, there to restock the coffee stations. Her access card, however, was still Julian's. She made her way to the 34th floor and settled into her dark closet. For hours, nothing happened. The building was silent except for the hum of the servers. Then at 2:17 p.m., she got the ping. File opened. The tracker flared to life on her screen. User A. Finch. Location, Executive Suite, 40th floor. His office. He had taken the bait. Clara's heart pounded. This was it. The tracker showed her what Finch was doing in real time. He wasn't just reading the file. He was attempting to cross-reference the fake vulnerability with the actual parasitic code, likely to see if anyone else had discovered his backdoor. In doing so, he had to decrypt a section of his own hidden code. For a fraction of a second, the master key, the kill switch for his entire siphoning operation, would be visible in the system's temporary memory cache. Clara's fingers flew across the keyboard. She had one shot at this. She had to execute a memory scrape at the precise microsecond the key was exposed. It was the digital equivalent of snatching a playing card from a professional magician in the middle of a shuffle. She initiated the command. Time seemed to slow. The progress bar on her screen crawled. 10%, 40%, 80%. Suddenly, an alert flashed across her monitor. Security override. Unauthorized access detected in Sector 7G. System lockdown initiated. Finch's system had detected her scrape. He knew. Alarms began to blare, faint at first, then growing louder. Red lights started flashing in the server room, casting demonic shadows on the walls of her tiny office. Her terminal went dead, the screen flashing a single ominous message: access denied. She was locked out, and worse, he had locked her in. A heavy clank echoed down the hall as the magnetic locks on the fire doors engaged. She was trapped on the 34th floor with the man she had just tried to expose. Her breath hitched in her throat. She could hear footsteps now, crisp and fast, coming down the hallway. They weren't the heavy tread of security guards. They were the confident, purposeful steps of Alistair Finch. The door to her closet office was flimsy. It had no lock. She scrambled back from the desk, her eyes darting around the small space for a weapon, a way out. There was nothing. The footsteps stopped just outside. A shadow fell across the crack of light under the door. The handle turned slowly. The door swung open with a soft click, revealing Alistair Finch. He wasn't angry. He was smiling. It was a cold, predatory smile that didn't touch his eyes. He held a tablet in one hand, its screen displaying a map of the floor with a single red dot pulsing in her exact location. Project Cassandra, he said, his voice smooth as silk. Clever. A little on the nose, but clever. I almost fell for it. He took a step into the tiny room, forcing Clara to press herself back against a rack of humming servers. The heat was scorching through her thin uniform. It's over, Alistair, she said, her voice trembling but determined. I have the logs. Julian will see what you've done. He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Julian sees what I allow him to see. You see, the difference between you and me, Clara, is that you think the code is the power. But the power isn't in the code. It's in who gets to write the narrative about the code. He held up his tablet. And right now, the narrative is this. A disgruntled new hire, a former waitress with a history of academic misconduct, was caught planting a malicious algorithm to frame a senior executive. A tragic story of ambition and deceit. Her blood ran cold. No one will believe that. Won't they? He countered, taking another step closer. The space was so small now she could smell his expensive cologne. You're a ghost. You have no history here, no allies. You were brought in through the back door by an old man who is starting to lose his edge. I, on the other hand, am the future of this company. I am on the cover of Forbes. Who do you think the board is going to believe? He had planned for this. Every move she made, he had anticipated. The lockdown wasn't just to trap her. It was to create a digital crime scene with her as the sole suspect. The logs she thought she had were now being rewritten, her every legitimate query twisted to look like an attack. Julian, trust me, she spat, a last desperate defense. Julian trusts results, Alistair corrected smoothly, and I have given him a decade of record-breaking profits. You've given him a headache. He's a sentimental old fool for bringing you in. But he's not stupid. When presented with the evidence, he will cut his losses. He will erase you. It's what he does. Fear gave way to a cold, hard knot of fury in Clara's stomach. He was right. In this world of power and perception, her truth was a flickering candle against his hurricane. But she had one thing he didn't. She had the key, the memory scrape. It had been interrupted, but had it failed completely? While Alistair monologued, his arrogance giving her precious seconds, she surreptitiously slid her hand into her apron pocket and felt the cool, smooth surface of a small flash drive. A habit from her university days, always back up everything to an offline, air-gapped device. She had initiated a continuous background dump of her work to the drive the moment she'd started. It wasn't the full key, but it might contain fragments, pieces of the truth. "So what now?" she asked, playing for time, her mind racing. "You call security? Have me arrested?" "Oh, it's much cleaner than that," he said, his smile widening. He gestured back toward the server rack she was pinned against. "A tragic accident, a faulty power conduit. You were in an unauthorized area during a system diagnostic. So sad. A promising, if troubled, young mind. Gone too soon." He reached into his suit jacket. Clara didn't wait to see what he was pulling out. She lunged, not at him, but sideways, toward the emergency fire suppression panel on the wall. Her grandfather, a man obsessed with redundancies and safety protocols after losing everything to a system with none, had drilled the layouts of commercial buildings into her head. "Always know your exits, Clara. Not just the doors." She slammed her palm onto the large red button. Instantly, the world erupted. A deafening klaxon blared. Emergency lights strobed, bathing the room in an eerie red glow. And from the ceiling, a torrential downpour of hail gas and fire-suppressant foam began to hiss down, dousing the servers in a thick white blanket. Alistair cried out in shock and rage as the icy foam hit him. The system lockdown he had initiated was now working against him. The halon gas would suffocate a fire in seconds. It would do the same to a person in Maine. The world returned in agonizing increments. First, the piercing, rhythmic shriek of the klaxon, a physical assault on her eardrums. Then the strobing crimson of the emergency lights, painting the scene in disjointed, hellish flashes. A bitter chemical cold seeped through her thin uniform, the fire-suppressant foam clinging to her skin like a shroud. Clara gasped, her lungs burning not from smoke, but from the raw, oxygen-starved air and the frigid shock. She was on her knees in the hallway, the cool marble a welcome anchor in the swirling chaos. Alistair Finch lay sprawled a few feet away, a grotesque parody of his usual immaculate self. He was retching, his face a mottled purple, his silk tie stained with white foam. But the moment his eyes focused, they locked onto her, and the raw, murderous intent within them was more terrifying than any alarm. He scrambled to his feet, a low growl tearing from his throat, and lunged. Clara flinched back, but a solid form moved between them. Not security, not at first. It was Julian Croft. He didn't look at Finch. He didn't speak. He simply planted his feet and raised a hand, a silent, absolute command to halt. Behind him, the head of security and two guards arrived, their faces grim, their movements practiced and efficient. Julian's gaze, a force of nature in its own right, was fixed entirely on Clara. It was an unnervingly complex expression. Not the cold fury she expected, not the condescending dismissal she had once endured, but a maelstrom of shock, raw concern, and a terrifying analytical intensity. He was cataloging her, the trembling of her hands, the foam in her hair, the fierce, defiant light that still burned in her eyes despite her exhaustion. "Report," he commanded, his voice a low gravel that cut through the din. It wasn't a question of her well-being. It was a demand for data. Clara pushed herself up, leaning against the wall for support. Her fingers, numb with cold, tightened around the small, precious weight in her pocket. "He initiated a full system lockdown," she managed, her voice a ragged whisper. "To trap me, to rewrite the logs and frame me. I triggered the fire suppression. It was the only protocol that could override his command authority." "Julian! Don't listen to her!" Finch shrieked, finding his voice. The security guards had him by the arms now, but his venom was unrestrained. "She's a corporate terrorist. She tried to destroy the servers. Look at this mess. She's trying to cover her tracks. Julian still didn't look at him. It was the most profound dismissal Clara had ever witnessed. It was as if Alistair Finch had already ceased to exist in his universe. "The drive," Julian said, his eyes still locked on hers. She pulled the flash drive from her pocket. It was slick with foam, but the small indicator light was blinking a steady, healthy green. "The memory scrape was interrupted," she said, her professional instincts overriding her fear. "The data is fragmented, corrupted, but it's not empty. The key, or pieces of it, should be in there. His signature, time-stamped to the decryption attempt. It's a digital fingerprint left at the scene." For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed Julian's face. Respect? No. It was something colder, more profound. It was recognition. He had seen the ghost, and now he was looking at the machine. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to his head of security. "Get him out of my sight. Confine him to the boardroom. No calls, no network access. He is to speak to no one but me." As Finch was hauled away, still screaming threats and accusations, Julian finally took in the full scope of the scene. The drowned, silent server room, a multi-million-dollar mausoleum of blinking red arrow lights, the hallways slick with foam, the lingering chemical stench, a muscle in his jaw clenched, a single visible sign of the fury churning beneath his iron control. He turned back to Clara. "My entire CDEC server farm is offline. The core of my trading operations is, for all intents and purposes, a block of ice. The failover systems are in a different state. We are blind until New York opens tomorrow. Do you have any idea of the financial exposure this represents?" The accusation was plain. The implicit threat hung in the air. "I do," she answered, meeting his gaze without flinching. "And I know it is a fraction of the exposure you would have faced when Alistair decided to cash out his ghost sequence and vanish, leaving you to explain to the SEC how your system had been compromised for years." The silence that followed was more deafening than the now dying alarms. He stared at her. This impossible girl in a ruined waitress uniform who had laid waste to a floor of his empire to save the kingdom itself. He saw the logic, the brutal calculus she had performed in a split second. Sacrifice the part to save the whole? It was a decision he himself would have made. It was the decision of a general, not a soldier. "My office, he said. The words clipped. He turned and walked away, not waiting to see if she would follow. He knew she would. The sun had set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the city. Julian's office was an island of quiet in the sea of controlled panic that had consumed the upper floors of Croft Capital. For hours, Clara had worked with a silent, intense focus, her fingers dancing over a keyboard connected to a forensic data recovery terminal. Julian sat behind his vast desk, not speaking, just watching. He made and received a dozen calls, his conversations terse, brutal, and efficient, calming investors, stonewalling reporters, and setting in motion a legal machine of terrifying power. But his attention always returned to her, to the young woman meticulously piecing together the digital soul of a traitor. Finally, she leaned back, her shoulders aching. "I have it," she said softly. "It's not the complete kill switch code. He was too smart for that. But it's enough. It's a chain of encrypted commands, digitally signed with his credentials, that connects his terminal directly to the parasitic algorithm. It shows him bypassing 3 security layers using executive privilege. He was checking on his parasite, and I took a snapshot of him with his hand in the vault." Julian rose and walked over, looming behind her to look at the screen. He saw the elegant, damning lines of code. It was a language he understood better than English. He placed a hand on the back of her chair, and she felt the slight, almost imperceptible vibration of tightly controlled rage. "It wasn't just about the money," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Skimming was the means, not the end. He was using my system as an incubator, a live-fire testing ground to perfect his own aggressive AI." He pointed to a subroutine she had unearthed. This is a predator. It learns. It adapts. It's designed to trigger market instability and then capitalize on the panic. He wasn't just stealing from me. He was building a weapon to wage war on the entire market. Clara felt a chill. He was building his ark, she whispered, and preparing for the flood he intended to create. Julian finished. He straightened up, his face a mask of cold fury. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. But that is the simple part. The board convenes in 1 hour. They have seen the preliminary damage reports. They know a senior executive is being detained. They smell blood. They will want a sacrifice. Clara's stomach tightened. Me. You are an unknown quantity, he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. An unregistered, unvetted consultant with the highest level of system access, found at the epicenter of a catastrophic hardware failure. From their perspective, Alistair's story, or a version of it, is plausible. He will paint you as a reckless hacktivist I foolishly brought in, someone who stumbled upon something she didn't understand and panicked. But the proof, she began, gesturing to the screen. This, he said, tapping the monitor, is complex. It's esoteric. A boardroom understands profit and loss. They understand share price and liability. They do not understand the ghost in the machine. Alistair is one of them. He speaks their language. You do not. He paused, his glacial eyes meeting hers in the reflection of the screen. So, you will have to learn in the next 55 minutes. The boardroom at Croft Capital was designed to intimidate. A single monolithic block of obsidian served as the table, surrounded by 20 severe leather chairs. The panoramic view of the glittering city skyline served as a constant reminder of the power wielded within these walls. When Clara entered behind Julian, the silence was immediate and hostile. 12 pairs of eyes, cold, calculating, and deeply skeptical, fixed on her. She was acutely aware of her wrinkled, foam-stained dress, a stark contrast to the bespoke suits and couture dresses of the board members. Alistair Finch sat at the far end of the table, flanked by a lawyer. He was changed into a fresh suit, his hair perfectly combed. He looked poised, concerned, and authoritative. He was the picture of a wronged executive. Julian, the chairman, Marcus Thorne, began, his voice like silk-wrapped steel. We have $1 billion hardware write-off, a C-level executive making accusations of corporate sabotage, and the SEC already asking for a preliminary brief. What in God's name happened tonight? Julian remained standing. Tonight, a cancer that has been growing within this company for years was excised. What you see as a disaster was, in fact, a necessary surgery. Mr. Finch has been systematically defrauding this company. The evidence is absolute. Finch's lawyer immediately spoke up. My client is the victim here. He discovered a massive security breach being perpetrated by this person. He gestured dismissively at Clara. And in her panic, she triggered a destructive protocol to cover her tracks. The board members murmured. The narrative was simple, clean, and believable. Miss Hayes, Julian said, his voice ringing with authority. He didn't look at her, but she knew this was the moment. The stage was hers. Clara stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt the weight of their collective disbelief, the ingrained prejudice against her age, her gender, her appearance. They saw a waitress. She had to make them see a mathematician. Mr. Thorne, members of the board, she began, her voice clearer and stronger than she'd expected. You are being told a story about a hardware failure, but the real story is about a philosophical flaw. For 18 months, Croft Capital has been the victim of a parasitic algorithm. She didn't use the terminal. She didn't point to complex data. She walked slowly along the side of the table, forcing them to look at her, to engage with her. You call it skimming, a technical term for theft, but that's not what it was. Every fraction of a cent that Alistair Finch stole was a tuition payment. He was teaching his own algorithm, a predatory AI, using this company's capital and infrastructure. He used your resources to build the weapon that he would one day use against you. This is baseless speculation, Finch's lawyer interjected. Clara stopped and looked directly at Alistair. Your algorithm has a tell, Alistair, a signature. It's not just aggressive, it's pathologically reckless. It favors high-risk, high-volatility scenarios. It doesn't just predict downturns, it actively seeks to amplify them. It's not designed to build wealth, it's designed to profit from collapse. She then turned back to the board. I didn't study your code in a vacuum. I cross-referenced its behavior with historical market events. 3 times in the last year, Major hedge funds have suffered catastrophic losses from flash crashes. Events the media blamed on market jitters or fat finger trades. They weren't. They were field tests. Finch was beta testing his weapon, using other firms as his lab rats. The money he stole from you was seed capital for a fund designed to short the entire global economy. A heavy silence descended on the room. She wasn't talking about code anymore. She was talking about a narrative they understood. Existential risk. Treachery. Marcus Thorne leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. You can prove this? The data is on the drive, Clara said, but you don't need to be a coder to understand it. You just need to look at the pattern. It's the story of a man building a lifeboat, not because he fears a storm, but because he's holding a lit match over the world's only oil field. Her words hung in the air, undeniable in their chilling logic. She had taken their complex problem and reframed it not as a technical issue, but as a human one, a story of hubris, greed, and betrayal. She had translated the grammar of the code into the language of power. Julian Croft watched, motionless. He saw the shift in the room. He saw the dawning horror in the eyes of his board members as they looked at Alistair Finch. No longer seeing a colleague, but a viper they had nurtured in their midst. It was over. Alistair knew it. His mask of indignant composure crumbled, revealing the raw, panicked fury beneath. He was erased. The weeks that followed were a blur of controlled demolition and painstaking reconstruction. The Finch scandal was a media firestorm, but Julian, with masterful precision, controlled the narrative. He presented it as a story of strength, a company that had discovered its own weakness and acted decisively to purge it. He took full responsibility, his reputation absorbing the brunt of the impact, shielding Clara completely. She remained a ghost, a consultant mentioned only in the deepest footnotes of the official reports. He didn't offer her a corner office or a fancy title. He gave her something far more valuable, a blank slate. The gutted, silent 34th floor became her laboratory. The budget was, he'd stated, whatever is required. Her mandate was simple and terrifying. Build the replacement, build the antidote. She did not work alone. Her first request was not for a team of Caltech PhDs. It was for a list of names. Names of people Julian's own system had flagged as obsolete. A behavioral economist who argued for irrationality in a world obsessed with logic. A military historian who specialized in the role of panic in command decisions. A retired options trader from the Chicago pits. A man whose instincts were legendary, but who couldn't write a line of code. She assembled a team of brilliant outcasts, people who, like her, saw the stories the machines missed. Her real work began there, in that rebuilt space, which they nicknamed the library. It was a clash of philosophies. Her coders battled with the historian over the relevance of the 17th century tulip mania. The psychologist argued with the quants about embedding cognitive biases into predictive models. It was messy, argumentative, and brilliant. Clara was not their boss. She was their conductor, orchestrating a symphony of dissonant ideas. Julian was a constant, looming presence. He would appear in the library at odd hours, prowling the floor, listening to the debates, studying the whiteboards filled with impossible equations and historical timelines. He rarely spoke, but she could feel him changing. The iron certainty that had defined him was being tempered with something new, curiosity. He was a man who had built a perfect, logical fortress, only to have a waitress show him that the real world was messy, illogical, and human, and that true strength lay in understanding that chaos, not just walling it off. One evening, she found him staring at the central screen, where a new visualization of the market was taking shape. It wasn't the sterile green and red ticker of old. It was a living thing, a swirling galaxy of data points where the size of the stars represented capital and their color represented market sentiment. A shade of blue for fear, a hue of gold for greed. It's beautiful, he said, his voice quiet, and terrifying. It's like looking at a God's eye view of a human soul. It's just the story, she replied, in a different language. He finally turned to look at her. The faint bruise on her arm from their first meeting had long since faded, but the memory of it still existed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of their brutal beginning. My first mentor, A man who still traded with pencil and paper told me the market had a heartbeat. I told him he was a romantic fool. I spent 40 years building a system with a perfect mind, only to realize I'd forgotten to give it a heart. He looked back at the screen. You didn't just find a thief, Miss Hayes. You reminded me of something I chose to forget. It was the closest he would ever come to an apology, and it was more than enough. Her new life began to take shape. Her grandfather was moved to a world-class neurological center, his debts erased as if they'd never existed. She visited him on a Sunday, finding him in a sunlit room overlooking a garden. He was sitting in a wheelchair, watching the financial news. She sat with him, and for a long time they didn't speak, just watched the endless scroll of numbers. His hand, frail and spotted with age, reached out and found hers. His eyes, clearer now than they had been in years, met hers. The rhythm is wrong, he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. They're all watching the wave, not the tide. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. I know, Grandpa, she said, squeezing his hand, but we're building a new chart, one that shows the tide. He smiled, a faint, slow thing, but it held the brilliant light of the man he had once been. It was a look of profound, peaceful vindication. His legacy was not lost. It was just being written in a new language. Months later, the new system, codenamed Janus, went live. There was no ceremony, no champagne. Just Clara, Julian, and her small team of misfits gathered in the library in the pre-dawn darkness. On the main screen, the galaxy of data pulsed, serene and ready. It won't be perfect, the historian warned. History never repeats itself perfectly. And people will always find new ways to be irrational, the psychologist added. It's a risk, Julian stated, watching the screen with an unreadable expression. Wall Street will call it sentimental nonsense. Let them, Clara said, her eyes fixed on the flow of data. She was no longer the girl in the shadows. She was a creator, an architect. She had faced down the Titan, and instead of destroying him, had shown him a new way to see. It's not about being perfect, it's about being wise. As the opening bell rang across the world, and Janus executed its first trade, a complex, counterintuitive hedge based not on immediate profit, but on a predicted wave of investor anxiety derived from geopolitical news, Julian didn't look at the profit and loss column. He looked at Clara. He saw the girl who had once scribbled patterns on a napkin, who had seen the flaw in his perfect fortress, who had walked through fire and emerged not burned, but forged. Your grandfather, Julian said, the words possessing a warmth she had never heard from him before, taught you to see the patterns in the numbers. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the controlled, beautiful chaos on the screen. You, Miss Hayes, have taught me to see the people in the patterns,